Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the 48th lecture. We are completing for 4 years now. I mean, we started during the COVID period. We kind of visualized this online lecture series on various topics, and slowly we are completing 4 years now. And thanks to all the participants and also the encouragement and enthusiasm. Today, we have with us Professor Stephen Sidebotham. I mean, I have very good memories with him because I was trained under him in field archaeology. In the excavation at Arikemedu in the year 1992, I was exposed to Harris Matrix way of excavating the trenches. It was wonderful to learn from him. And also there was Dr. Vimla Begli. So I fondly remember, I used to remember Dr. Selva. So we are really fortunate to have with us Professor Stephen. I really thank you for sparing your valuable time for giving a talk on the recent findings at Berenike. And I also welcome all the participants for this lecture. So I request Purva to give a brief introduction. Then I will ask Professor Stephen to start the lecture. Purva?
Right. Thank you, sir. Dr. Sidebotham is a highly distinguished historian and archaeologist with a career spanning over 40 years. He holds a PhD in ancient history from the University of Michigan and has been a professor at the University of Delaware since 1981. Renowned in his expertise in Greco-Roman history and ancient maritime trade, Dr. Sidebotham has co-directed the acclaimed Berenike archaeological Egypt's eastern desert, leading 70 seasons of fieldwork across 11 countries. His research has produced several landmark publications, including Berenike, the ancient maritime spice route, and the Red Land, along with contributions to over 177 articles and book chapters. Fluent in various ancient and modern languages, he has delivered lectures in over 20 countries. His work has garnered international recognition, featured in National Geographic, The New York Times, and Smithsonian Magazine, cementing his lasting impact on the fields of ancient history and archaeology. We are very privileged to have you with us for the webinar, sir. You may please begin your lecture. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And so I'm representing, of course, our entire team from Berenike, because, of course, all of the evidence I'm going to talk to you about today is produced not just by me. And you'll see, especially since I'm dealing primarily with material from the subcontinent, from India, I am not a specialist on southern India by any means, even though I've excavated there. So I'm very indebted to numerous specialists on our team who are Indologists and who can read the Indian languages and can identify some of the things that we found. So having said that, let me give you a little bit of background about Berenike. You can see on this large map here its location. It's near the border with Sudan, between Egypt and Sudan. And as you can see, it deals not just with maritime trade, but overland trade as well, because to get over to the Nile Valley, to transport objects to and from the Nile Valley, of course, they had to go by caravan, donkey or camel. So it's not just a port for the sea, also a port for the trade coming across the desert from the Nile Valley. And you can see the various places that were fairly certain Berenike was in touch with in the subcontinent. And what we didn't put here is its contacts with Sri Lanka, Taprobane, which we know were extensive as well in the later period. But there's only so much I can talk about in the time available. So we left that out. So we know that the trade networks that Berenike had spread from as far west as, I don't know if you can see my cursor, as Spain and Portugal and Morocco in the Western Mediterranean, and as far east as Java. Can you hear me okay? You can hear me okay?
Yeah, sure. We can.
Okay. So, and as far east as Java, we found this bead, unfortunately, on the surface. No, it comes from Jatim in eastern Java. Beads that may have been made in Vietnam or Thailand, but we're not 100% certain about that. We have nothing from China so far. So what we do have, it's as you would expect at a huge international port. We have many different languages, evidence of at least 12 written languages so far. These are, of course, European, mainly Greek and Latin, a number of African languages and Asian ones as well. So that obviously tells us something about, the types of people who are passing through here, if not actually living here, to conduct trade. Now, Berenike was founded in the 3rd century BC by one of the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt, Ptolemy II, who was the son of one of Alexander the Great's generals. And it became an important trade route in that period. Here you can see the Ptolemaic Empire, when they mainly imported elephants for use in battle. Of course, that was a tradition they picked up through Alexander when he visited your part of the world and ran into some elephants when he was fighting some of the Indian monarchs. Now, when the Romans took over Egypt, you can see how much bigger the Roman Empire is than the Ptolemaic. Berenike's status really grew incredibly. The trade now probably multiplied by a factor of 10 and involved, of course, you can see a huge area involving a population in the west of maybe roughly 60 million people in the Roman period. And of course, its trade contacts grew with areas not just in the Mediterranean, but the Red Sea, the African coast of the Indian Ocean, Southern Arabia, India, Sri Lanka, and the Persian Gulf. So here you see the location on these maps and on the satellite image. I think if you immediately see the Sinai Peninsula here. Suez is about here where the cursor is, and Berenike lies about 825 kilometers southeast of Suez, and then the major port on the Nile at Aswan is about 260 kilometers away from Berenike. So it's in a good location from the point of view of shipping coming in from the Indian Ocean. And of course, anytime you want to sail into or out of Berenike, you have to consider the wind patterns in the Red Sea, and you see those there on the left. And then, of course, very importantly, the monsoons in the Indian Ocean. So the monsoons, which is, very well, change directions during a calendar year. And the wind patterns in the Red Sea are going to dictate exactly when people can arrive or depart from Berenike by sea. So there's a time of year when there's a lot of activity going on at Berenike. Ships arrive from Southern Arabia or from India. And by the same token, when they're exporting things from Egypt. The other times a year, not as much is going on, but there are people living at the port all year round. Now we have conducted what we call a geomagnetic map. This is like an X-ray. When you go to the dentist's office, it's like an X-ray of what's immediately below the surface at Berenike. So you can see very clearly the areas we haven't dug, which are huge amounts of acreage. And we can see very clearly the buildings here. So the advantage of having something like this is that it tells us exactly where we should lay our trenches out. Instead of putting our trenches randomly, we can say, okay, we'd like to put a trench inside this particular building. And so we're able to do that. Now, we do not have a complete geomagnetic map of the site because every year we go out and there's a sandstorm or something, more of the site is uncovered. So in fact, depending on which way the sandstorms have blown. So this area up in here, we now know has a lot of buildings that we didn't know before. Now, to give you an idea of the size of the site, this red box is 10,000 square meters. So you can see it's a sizable site, and we'll be digging there for many, many generations to come. Now, these are the trenches that we've excavated in the past 30 years. We started working here in 1994. And this is the major part of the site. You can see we've dug very, very low, maybe 2% of this site is all we've dug in 30 years. And here are the major areas where we've concentrated the major parts of the site, which we can't look at everything, of course, but some of these, of course, will figure in my talk. So there's two major parts to this talk. The first is a presentation of some of the artifacts, like pottery, textiles, things like that, and ecofacts, these like botanical remains or the remains of animals excavated at Berenike. Now, these may or may not tell us that Indians were present at the port, because a lot of these things could have been brought in by third parties, right? They're evidence for activity at the port involving Indian-made objects or Indian-made material from plants or animals, but they're not necessarily indicative of the presence of Indians. So I'll go through that first. And then the second category is going to be discoveries we've made, which tell us 100% certainty that there were Indians living at Berenike. Okay, so let's take a look at these. And many of these, you may have seen some of these pictures elsewhere before. You're all familiar, I think, with the rouletted ware, which is all over the subcontinent and turns up in Southeast Asia. We have a fair amount of it at Berenike, actually. There's some good examples obviously made in India. This appears on a 5th century AD sherd, and as you all know, it's of course a good luck symbol in the subcontinent. And then very early on in the 1990s, we found this Roman amphora sherd, but carved, as you can see, with a Tamil Brahmi graffito. But again, all of these things could have come into Berenike without any Indians carrying them to the port, right? Okay, we just did that. Let's go the other way. Okay, and then we have lots of pottery, not just fine ware, but cooking wares and coarse wares, and many of these, of course, you'll quickly recognize from your own work in India. We got part of a lamp here, the paddle and press pottery. Some of these sherds that, of course, have Mortimer Wheeler designations. So we find a fair amount of this material at the site, both in the 1st century and 2nd century AD, as well in the 4th and the 5th centuries AD. Let me talk a little bit now about some of the botanical remains, which are really interesting. We found huge quantities of black peppercorns at the site, and the most astonishing find in 1999 in this trench here, you see these two large jars. They're both made in India in the 1st century AD. This one here, without the wooden lid, and you can see they're lifting it out of the trench here, contained over 7.5 kilograms of black peppercorns. This is the largest concentration of black peppercorns anywhere in the Western world. I'm not sure if such a quantity has ever been found at an Indian site, but certainly at ours. And you can see our registrar, she's taking the peppercorns out of the jar to weigh them. They, of course, black pepper. This would have come from the Ghat mountain region of Kerala. And of course, obviously, it's evident for some already knew that is contacts between southwestern India, probably through Muziris to Berenike. But we have a lot of other types of finds as well that come either from India or from the northwestern Indian Ocean. We have a lot of coconuts, coconut husks at different levels, both early Roman and that is 1st century AD and into the 5th. Which, of course, these might not be from India. They could be from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. And then we have these seeds down here, which you probably will recognize, especially if you're older and ever went to some of the gold shops in India. You'll find they use these to weigh gold because these are the Abrus precatorius seeds are very uniform in weight. So we found, we found these at the site. And then if just in case you're not sure what pepper looks like in the original, these are pictures I took back in 2008 in Kerala. and you can see the pepper clinging vine. It usually clings to a larger tree. And this is what the peppercorns look like before they're harvested. And then, of course, then they're harvested and they dry out like this. And then you end up like this spice shop in Kochi. In Malabar, you can see the various types of pepper there. So lots of different kinds of pepper were sent to the West: long pepper, white pepper, black pepper. But we've only found the black peppercorns at Berenike. We have not found any other types of peppercorns. Now, this is what the Abrus precatorius plant looks like. And I'm sure you've seen this all over India. It's a very invasive species, and you definitely do not want to eat these because they'll kill you. They're highly toxic. So you definitely want to stay away from putting these in any milkshakes or tea or anything else that you have. Now, none of these pictures here are from Berenike, but they represent the kinds of plant remains we have found at Berenike, which are clearly coming from your part of the world, from the Indian subcontinent. So we have the mung, see the Latin name for it there. Rice, of course, but rice didn't come only from India. Rice, we know, was cultivated in the West. That is in Arabia and in Egypt as early as the 2nd century AD. So we can't be completely certain that the rice we're finding at Berenike is from India, although most likely it was. And then Job's tear, you may be familiar with this. It's not eaten, but you drill through it. You can make beads and jewelry out of these. So this we found in some numbers at the site. And very interestingly, and this is relatively recently, we found an animal cemetery, a cemetery of people's household pets. And over 700 of them we have so far. Many of them are wearing collars, and we know that they were people's pets. And included in this, as you can see here, we have cats and macaque monkeys that come, again, from South Asia and or from Central Asia. So we found these. And you can see the geographical extent of some of the macaques here in southern and central India. So again, these probably undoubtedly came by sea, whether they were stowaways or whether they were somebody's pets that they were bringing with them. Of course, we don't know. And then again, we have, a few Indian coins that we found at the site. Here's some Satavahan ones that we found inside a temple that I'll talk about later. We've only found 2 of those. And then we also found this later one from the 4th century AD from Western India, which we found actually in a church, a 5th century AD church on the site. We have lots of beads. Many of the beads are these Indo-Pacific glass ones that you see, the little monochrome ones that are blue or yellow or orange. And then we have a lot of fancy that we know were made in India. We've got garnet. We have carnelian. We also found cameo blanks, and you may be familiar with these. That we turned up a fair number of these in our excavations at Arikamidu in the late 80s, 90s, and also at Ptolemaic. And when I was there anyway in 2008, and we turn them up also at Berenike, and this is what they look like. They're basically banded agates, and they have to be prepared. And then in the West, they're carved into cameos that look like this. Okay, this particular cameo, of course, is not from Berenike, but you get an idea of, once you cut these up, what they look like. So these are also in demand in the West, in the Mediterranean. Very interestingly, we've turned up large numbers of textiles made in India. And one that was particularly interesting for us was this one. It doesn't look like much, but you can see it's resist-dyed textile with these rosettes. And we found parallels, interestingly, in India to caves, dating from exactly the same period, ours in a 5th century AD rubbish dump. And you can see on cave number 17, from Ajanta, you can see exactly the same kind of wall hanging painted here. And I've also seen exactly the same kind of thing in the museum in China at Urumqi, where they found some of these same kinds of textiles along the northern arm of the Silk Road, passing through the Taklamakan Desert. Now, interestingly, These heads, which we found in 2019, are made of teak wood. Teak, of course, comes from India. They're quite large. This is a 20 centimeter scale. They represent an Egyptian deity called Serapis. And these were originally gilded. And why am I showing you these? Well, they're made of teak. And you say, well, did they import this teak specifically to make these heads? Probably not. We guess that these were original ships that came in. As you know, teak is a very timber to build ships from. And we know we have a large amount of teak wood at Berenike, which has been recycled, as I'll show you in a minute, from ships into the architecture. We guess that these various teak heads were probably recycled from ship masts or artimons, because the ships would come in from India. Of course, they would have been damaged by the monsoon winds and the winds in the Indian Ocean. And instead of just destroying the wood or burning it, they recycled it. And so our guess is they recycled parts of the ships to make these particular heads. You can see some other things here. These are pieces of lead that in the Roman period would have been secured to the ship's hull to prevent microorganisms from destroying the hull. Here's a little image of a ship that we found. This is a brailing ring, so they would use these to pass the ropes to raise and lower the sail. And these were used to secure the sails properly. You see here and here, secure the sails to ropes onto the ship. And here's some more. So here's that same ship graffito. This is probably part of a lifting net. Again, more brailing rings to use to raise and lower the sails. Interestingly, our textile specialists have examined the sail fragments, and guess what? They're made in India. They're not made in the West. So it's clear that when ships would arrive from the West to, ports in India, they would need repair. And so what a surprise, they would be repaired using Indian materials. And then they'd arrive back in the Red Sea, the Mediterranean world, and those objects would have to be replaced as well, because of course they'd been damaged on the trip coming across the Indian Ocean and up the Red Sea. So here's some more brailing rings, more of the lead that they used to protect the hulls. And then we actually found the ship timbers themselves. Two kinds. We found one's made of cedar, which is these. These would have been from trees from Lebanon and the Mediterranean. We also found a large amount of teak wood, as I'll show you. So let me show you. These are charred ship parts, hull parts from a ship dating to the 1st or 2nd centuries AD. Lots of ropes, large ropes probably used to secure the ships when they arrived in port. These are made with a type of technique called mortise and tenon. This is a very common shipbuilding technique used in the Mediterranean in the Roman period. So now we know from our excavations that at least some of the ships, not all, but some of the ships plying the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean were made in a Roman building tradition. We also found the remains of a frame here. And this is how the frame would have fit into the hull of a. So these are all made of cedar wood. What we found in large numbers recycled into the buildings in the late Roman period at Berenike. So basically that means the 4th and 5th centuries AD. You can see they dismantled ships and used the timber from the hulls as leveling courses in the architecture. So you can see here very clearly all these slots that would have joined one part of a hull to another. These have been disassembled, obviously, and recycled into these buildings. And we have quite a bit of that across the site in the late period. So here's another one. This one's over 3 meters long. Again, you can see the little holes. Okay, this is one of the many cult centers, religious centers that we found at the site. Here's some more details from that same one, showing this particular beam that's over 3 meters long. And then here's some more recycled into, again, another late building. So we have a lot of clearly from ships that have come in the 4th centuries from India because, of course, the teak wood is from there. There's no teak in the Mediterranean or the Sea. We also actually found anchors, iron anchors recycled into some of the buildings. So here you see part of an iron anchor here recycled into one of the buildings at Berenike. So teak was used extensively here in these late Roman buildings, and by late Roman, I mean 4th, 5th century AD. You can see all of these little shelves, and these are made again of recycled teak wood. So obviously, a lot of recycling of ship parts. When they built some of the temples in Berenike, they again took ship parts, cut them down to make them into building clamps. These would be used to then clamp stones together. And just in case you're not familiar with what a teak tree looks like, excuse me, and the Latin name is Tictona grandis. Here you can see some samples. These are all pictures taken, not by me. I got these off the internet, but these are all from India. And then very interesting, we have other types of wood at Berenike that we actually haven't found the remains of the wood, but we have references to them. So this is a papyrus document. We just found this in January, this past January. And it's a long papyrus, and it mentions Indian rosewood. And we found no Indian rosewood at the site thus far, but clearly this papyrus discusses it. So it had to have been imported for some purpose at Berenike from India. Now, let me show you a little very interesting find that we made in 2001 in an early Roman rubbish dump dating from the 1st century AD. It was this trench right here. And here he is. And when we first found him, we thought he was a Roman, represented a Roman soldier. And I'll show you the evidence for that. But we've now rethought it, and we're now pretty sure it's actually a terracotta made in the tear of it. You can see it's damaged. And then he had a little hole in his shield where he probably would have held up a wooden or a metal spear. You can see that there, it's not very large. And so you can see why we originally thought it might be a Roman soldier. All of the monuments I'm showing you here are Roman in date from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And you can see that there's some similarities, or there seem to be similarities between the armor he's wearing and the armor that these Roman troops are wearing. Here's some more. So you can see why we originally thought, well, the guy probably represents a Roman soldier. But then, like I said, one of our group looked at it again and said, I don't think he's a Roman. I think he might be a Yavana, a representation of a Yavana, but he's not a Roman. So this person, and I think she's right, traced it back to Tagara or Ter in India. Had a huge, as you know, core plastic industry making terracottas. And so it would have been very easy, of course, for these to have arrived in the West through Barigaza or Muziris or one of the other ports on the western coast of India. So in case you're unaware, here's the location of Ter. And so then we started to look at Indian parallels. So here are some terracottas manufactured from Ter. We're not sure exactly when these were manufactured, but take a look at the similarities here with eyes especially. Here's a carving from the Satavahana period. So we're fairly certain now that this individual was probably a Yavana, and it was made in India, and it was not made in the West, representing a Roman soldier. Okay, so that's all circumstantial evidence that I've shown you that suggests Indians were physically present at Berenike. But of course, all of these items that I've shown, cats or the monkeys or the textiles or the terracotta, could have come in and could have been brought theoretically by somebody else, right? But now I want to look at the evidence that tells us 100% certain there were different Indians not just living at Berenike, but living there over probably a fairly substantial period of time. And these finds actually have only come up very recently, really since about 2018. And I'll just give you a little bit of a preview. So far, we've found 3 different images of Buddha. The main one everybody sees on the internet is the marble one, but we have 3 in fact. I'll show you those. We also have a relief of 3 Hindu gods, only of Buddha, but of the Hindus as well. And you say, well, how do you know? These also could have been brought in by somebody else. Well, the thing is, the stone used to make them is from the Mediterranean, which means they were made at Berenike. Okay, means what? No Roman's going to make images of these. It's got to be evidence for Indian presence at the port. Plus, we have a fantastic Sanskrit inscription, the only one found in the West to date, and it's very nicely dated. I'll show you that as well. So let's take a look at the Isis temple, which is a huge one of the many temples at Berenike. It's the largest one on the site, the most wealthy one on the site. It sits at the very top highest part of the site. And in that, so here it is right here, in several trenches between 2019 and 2022, we found some images. We also found some other ones earlier in 2018 up here. So let's take a look at trenches first in the Isis temple, and then later up in here. So this is what we call an orthophoto, the Isis temple. It's almost like an aerial photograph, but of course, this has been taken over several seasons from around 20 up until 2024. When we dig new areas, we do photos, take many different angles. These can then be put together in a program to present to you basically what looks like an aerial view. And a lot of these areas, of course, are now covered. We've covered this with the roof. This has been backfilled with dirt. So if you go today, you're not going to see any of this. It's all been protected. But this is the entrance. This is the portico. This is the courtyard, which is very important. It was not roofed. And this is the temple proper. So let's look at what we found here. Here is a view of the courtyard area. So basically this area here. All of these blocks that you see all had statues on them. They all had inscriptions on them, pretty much almost all in Greek from the Roman period, except one. And you'll see that one in just a second. So here's a view of just the courtyard area. Looking to the north, there's one of our Bedouin workmen for scale. And the little triangle, it's where we found the fragments of the marble Buddha statue that you've seen, you know, all over the news and everything else. So we found this over 2 seasons. The first fragments we found in 2018, and we didn't know what it was. We didn't know what they were. And then the head, the spectacular head, we found in 2022. So let me show you these. So here's again a plan of the temple, and you can see where we found these pieces. So the Buddha body and parts were found here. And then the Sanskrit inscription I'm going to show you, which was probably set up in about the same area as the Buddha statue, we found here. And then over in here, we found another Buddha head, and we found the relief depicting the 3 Hindu deities. So it's all very exciting. Of course, when we found these, we didn't know what we had because none of us are Indologists, but we quickly rectified that by bringing people in who could identify these things and could read the we found. And it was all very exciting. So here's a photograph showing you the state of the excavations inside the Sanskrit inscription were found in 2022, and you can see the location of where they were found. So all these objects were found fairly close together. The issue is, as you'll see, the marble Buddha, we can fairly certainly date to the period roughly 90 AD to 140 AD, whereas the Sanskrit inscription dates to over 100 years later to 248 AD. So while the two may have been set up nearby to one another, they were made by sculptors or by stonemasons over 100 years. Okay, so here's how we found the head, the marble head of the Buddha. Okay, and you can see this, the face itself we found upside down. Part of the radiant crown we found there. We found the body in 2018, but again, as I told you, none of us were Indologists, so we didn't really know what we found. And it was only when I went to a conference in Germany in 2019, where there were a number of Indian specialists in the audience, and I showed this image, and they said, "Oh, that's a Buddha." I said, "Oh, okay, that's great. It's made of marble, and it's not made in India, as I'll show you." So here's the head. So as I said, we found this part of the head. We didn't understand what this was in 2018, and then we found the rest of the head, which you can see in fragments here. This is the back, here's the front, in 2022. And we then realized that the head went with body that we'd found 4 years earlier. And so this is the whole together, such as we have it now. There are the measurements for it. So it's 71.1 centimeters tall. We know it was made in this period that I've mentioned before, and I'll show you the evidence for that. And of course, it has huge similarities, parallels with many, many Buddha images in the subcontinent, as well as the reverse of this coin, this Kushan coin of Kanishka I. We didn't find the coin at Berenike, but again, you can see the similarities in the drapery, him holding parts of the drapery with his left hand, the radiate crown, it's not radiate here. And of course, on the Kanishka coin, it's labeled as Buddha. So, there's no doubt about who that is. So now the marble we've traced as not from India. The marble comes from the Mediterranean. And in fact, we know the quarry it came from. It came from a quarry called the Provenances quarries here, number 25, which, as you can see, are not far from Istanbul in Turkey. So what does that mean? Well, it means somebody, an Indian who had been at Berenike for some extended period and had the extra money to do this, ordered the carving of this statue. No one in the West would have known how to carve a statue of Buddha, but somebody going to a workshop, an Indian who knew about what Buddha looked like, or maybe had a drawing of it, or maybe a wooden image of it, would go into the workshop of this Roman and say, "Okay, hey, look, I need you to do this." So he was probably, or they were overseeing, obviously, the Roman sculptors in this work, but it had to have been done in the West, and most likely at Berenike, given the fact that the marble itself comes from the Mediterranean. So now, here's some of the parallels. So here's the Buddha head again, two different views of it. And you can see some of the comparisons with some of the Buddha hairstyles. Some of them, you can see this here looks a little bit like this one up here, but these others, not quite. And then when we start looking at Roman period, 80 to 90, up to 140 AD, these were very, very popular hairstyles among Roman women in the Mediterranean at the time. And you can very clearly see some incredibly close parallels here between the sculptures from this period and our Buddha sculpture. So the Buddha sculpture is not exactly a copy of one you would see in India. Obviously, it has a lot of elements from that, but it also pulls elements from the Mediterranean. So it's an interesting, if you will, material example of sort of the hybrid of Buddha from India and the Western idea of what Buddha might look like with this hairstyle. And of course, one of the other features is the lotus flower, which is obviously frequently associated with Buddha. Here you can see it in an unusual position off to his left. And then where is the inspiration for this coming from? Well, from the subcontinent, it's probably coming from Gandhara, of course. That's the obvious connection. And of course, through Gandhara, it probably did not come overland. This artistic style probably came again through one of the ports, either Barbaricone or Barigaza, one of the two. That's the most likely route for that connection. And again, here you can see, we know from I'm sure you're familiar with the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that first century document written in Greek that talks about the various ports and products available to merchants in the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Indian subcontinent. So the ports, all of these ports, Berenike, Barbaricum, Barigaza, are mentioned frequently in the Periplus. And so we know that there were numerous connections, at least in the first century, second century, between Berenike in the west and Barbacom and Bari Gaza in India. Okay, so let's take a look now at something that is incredibly amazing. You can imagine our excitement when we found that Buddha head in marble in January of 2022. 30 minutes later, the same day, just half an hour later, we found the Sanskrit inscription. So you can imagine that was a very, how could you not get excited, right? A very exciting day for us. So you can see the location of the find of the Sanskrit inscription is very, very close to the Buddha. But again, it dates over 100 years later than the Buddha. And how do we know this? Okay, this is where okay, here it is. So this is how we found it. It's a fairly large stone. You can see the dimensions here. It's local stone. This is local to Berenike. This was quarried at Berenike, which means the person who carved the sand was at Berenike. And it's got to be somebody from your one's going to know how to do this. So this is what it looked like when we found it. This is the overwrite in green by our Indologist, our Sanskrit specialist. There was also Greek associated with this, although the Greek was much shorter. And you can see the red is a reconstruction of the parts that are missing. So that gives you an idea of the physical appearance of this inscription, but it's precisely dated. And I'll show you how we know that. It's dated precisely to September 9th, 248 AD, which puts it at least a century older than the marble Buddha. But again, they're standing close to one another. So this suggests what? Well, that there was obviously Indians living at the port over extended period of times from at least the late 1st century AD and to the middle of the 3rd with all of this material. It doesn't lie. Here's basically what it says, and it's not a word-for-word translation. What makes it so interesting and unique is that in addition to mentioning the dedicant and his warrior class status, it mentions the name of a Roman emperor in Sanskrit. And his name was Philip I. We know when he lived, we know when he reigned, and the dating used associated with his reign and on the Sanskrit inscription arrives at this precise date of September 9th, 248 AD. There's been very similar ones found on Hoke Cave, if you're familiar with the cave on Socotra in the Indian Ocean that has hundreds of graffiti in the cave. It has similar groups of warrior class who were involved in the maritime trade. So our man at Berenike is not a unique figure in terms of involvement in the maritime trade. Okay, let's go to another part of the temple now. This was actually a little room that was stuck onto the southern side of the temple. You see 6, a little room that was added to the back side of the temple, probably in the 4th or 5th century AD. So here it is. If you take a look, hang on, let's go back. Don't look at this right now. It's this room right here. Okay. Whoops. Before I do that, let me go back to this. Before we leave the front part of the temple, let me do this. So we found the Sanskrit inscription and the Buddha, marble Buddha in this area here. When we go to the portico, which separates obviously the courtyard from the entrance, you see the white arrow pointing to this bench. Okay. Well, it's very interesting because we only noticed this. We excavated this back in 2022, but we only noticed this very faint graffito carved on this bench last season. And you can see how the bench fits in here. So here's the entrance, here's the portico, and here's the bench itself. It's very faint, but we've had a Tamil specialist look at this, and she says, she's in Paris, and she says, well, this is a Tamil Brahmi graffito, probably from the 2nd or the 3rd century AD, and it's a donation of a pedestal for a female deity. And we don't know what female deity. You can see it's very, very faint. Since we just discovered this, we're still working on it, so I can't really give you too much more information about that. But as you see, the more we excavate, the more Indian material we find. Now, let me go, I jumped ahead a little bit. Let's go to this little room on the southern side of the temple that was added probably in the 4th or 5th century. When we excavated this back in 2019, it turned out to be a room just full of wooden, bronze, and stone sculpture and artifacts. And what we concluded was all of these artifacts had a date range from early to late Roman, but they were all deposited here in the Roman period, that is in the 4th or 5th century. So we believe they're originally decorating the inside of the temple, probably in the courtyard. And for whatever reason, they were collected and dumped in here in the 4th or 5th century AD. And we had some very interesting objects from here. So here I've located this in green for you here. We had a small little head of Buddha, local stone, by the way. And we had this relief, the stela, also made in local stone, representing avatars of 3 Indian gods, probably Hindu, we now know. So here's views of this little room. You can see it was just added on to the southern side of the temple. It's not big at all. That's a 50-centimeter scale. So you can see the room itself is tiny, but it was just packed with wooden, stone, and bronze objects. So let me show you the little Buddha first. So it's not very well made. You can see, but we know it's a Buddha from the top knot, and the ears would probably originally have been painted. The paint, of course, has disappeared. And what's so interesting about this is this was carved at Berenike. We don't know that the marble Buddha was. We know the marble Buddha was carved somewhere in the Mediterranean, probably at Berenike. This was carved at Berenike. It's from a local stone from Berenike. So what makes it interesting, here's our little Buddha head from this area. Look at these other heads that we found. These all date between the 1st and the 3rd centuries AD. And if you start comparing the mouth and the eyes, you can see our Buddha figure came from the same workshop at Berenike that produced these other more standard, typical Greco-Roman heads that you would expect to see at a site like ours. So clearly manufactured in a workshop at Berenike that produced sculpture of other deities. And clearly they wouldn't have done this unless someone had said, hey, I need this head, and I'll show you what you need to do. And so the shop at Berenike did that for them. And then we found this in the same little room that I just showed you a picture of. This is what it looked like when we found it. So this is in situ. This sat in the northwestern corner of that little room that I showed you a moment ago. It's broken. The bottom half is missing. So we don't know what, if anything, might have been there. You can see avatars of 3 Hindu deities. These have now been identified by an Indian numismatist at the Ashmolean in Great Britain. And he's identified them as these 3 deities here. Again, you can see the quality here is not as good as the marble Buddha. It's about the same quality as the little Buddha head that I showed you here. Now, these were probably originally painted, but of course we don't know that. The paint is gone. The area beneath them, if that was originally painted or not, of course, again, we don't know. But here are parallels. So these are coins, as you can see, from the Bactrian area of India, showing these deities, and they're in the same general poses that the ones on our stela have here. Here's another one. It's not very good, but you can see it here, a punch mark coin from the late 3rd into the 2nd century BC. Okay, let's go and take a look at the 3rd Buddha. Remember, I told you there were 3 Buddhas that we found thus far at Berenike. So we've seen the marble one, the one everybody's seen before, from the Isis temple courtyard, a little stone head that probably you hadn't seen before from that little room south of the Isis temple. We're now going to a different part of the site up in here, circled in red. So here's the Isis temple in 7. 8 is the northern complex, as we're calling it now. And in excavations here in 2018, we turned up, again, as you'll see, and not very tall, a small statuette in stone. And again, we time, but now we know it's a standing. Here's the room in which we found it, and this room was also filled with a lot of stone and bronze sculpture and so on. A lot of it was religious in nature. So these are three different views of this room, of this trench, and it was in here that we found this. So here you can see three different views of this statue made of gypsum. So it's locally made as well. You can see it's not big. This is a 5-centimeter scale. And here's the front, here's a left side view and a back view. But you can see the drapery, and then he's also holding in his left hand that part garment that you see typically held by Buddhist statues elsewhere. And again, here's some comparisons. So here's the marble Buddha. Here's from the Isis temple courtyard. This is the one we just found in the northern complex. And of course, there's many images of Buddha from the subcontinent that have very similar poses. So this is all in keeping with the image of Buddha. So that's how we identify the figure without feet as a Buddha figure. So that's our third Buddha image. And again, plenty of parallels here. There's the gypsum one. Here's the marble one. This is our coin of Kanishka, the first. Here's another seated image. So it's very, very common for Buddha to hold that garment like that in his left hand. Okay, hopefully this has given you a quick overview of some of the interesting finds. In this case, I've only focused, of course, on India, the subcontinent. But, you know, obviously there's a lot more I could have shown you, both from the subcontinent as well as from other areas of the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean world. But of course, we only had so much time. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. I'll go back to the
Thank
start
you.
here.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this wonderful talk. We have requested the participants if they have any questions. So far, we have not received any questions as of now. Otherwise, I may request some of the participants.
By the way, just
one participant, Jenny Peter, she's asking about more information about the church found at Berenike.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't talk about that because the only Indian-related find from the church was the coin of Rudrasena III that I showed you from 362 AD. So yeah, we've there's only 2 rooms in the church we have not excavated, but the church itself sits on the southern side of this larger building, and then there's a corridor just to the north of the church that runs east-west, and north of that are facilities where the priests or the monks or the people taking care of the church would have lived. So we have a kitchen, there's living quarters, all the kinds of things, storage rooms for where they would have food and so on. So again, I didn't talk about that because there's only so much I can do, but we certainly published a lot about the church, and if you want to send me an email, I can send you more about that. I wanted to mention that all of this Indian material, with the exception of the recently discovered Tamil Brahmi graffito on the bench, we've written that up. It will be published next year in a German journal. It's a very, very long article with lots of photographs and, of course, lots of footnotes. And if you're interested, it won't come out till the end of 2025, but I'd be glad to send it to anybody who would like to have a copy of it. It'll be fairly definitive. I can't hear. I cannot hear you.
Someone left their mic on.
Okay. Well, I'll be glad to send that to anybody who wants it once it appears. So that will give you the information about all the Buddhas and the Sanskrit inscription and the little terracotta warrior that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. So any other questions?
Yeah, there is one more question.
Scylla, hi, how are you?
There is one more question by Nidhi Kati. Can goddess Isis be similar to the goddess of India? Any goddess of India?
It's a good question. I'm sure she is, but I'm not sure which one. Isis was, of course, a deity originally associated with pharaonic Egypt. She goes way, way back to the 3rd millennium BC. And she world, their son was Horus, who was a very important sun god in Egypt. And Isis continued to be very important in the Roman period. All throughout the Mediterranean, she was always associated with sailors. So you can see why she would have been popular. The inscriptions, we have probably 50 inscriptions from the Isis temple alone from the Roman period in Greek. Greek was the language used in the Eastern Roman world. They date from 48, they actually date a little earlier, probably from the 30s AD up until the 4th century AD. And Isis is repeatedly mentioned as being the savior of sailors or protecting people from shipwrecks, all this kind of thing. So you can see why she would have a big temple at Berenike. She was very popular, obviously, not just with Romans and Egyptians, but with Indians too. They make a straight line to the temple and say, okay, thank you for saving us, for our ships arriving safely. And so what's interesting about the temple is that it's to many, many different deities, and everybody was fine with that. Nobody had a problem with deities from all over the world being celebrated here. It was fine, not a problem.
Yeah, it's like the Socotra cave.
Yeah, I've been to Socotra. We did a survey there in I think 2006 or 7, but I've never been to Hoke Cave, and I believe that it's very inaccessible today. I think they've tried to close it off and protect it from visitors, but I would love to go and see that.
There is one question from Geeta. She's asking, I'm a botanist, and I had read about findings of moong that pulses in Berenike, and they stated
the mung beans? Hang on.
Yeah, that.
Let me go to that.
Yeah.
Just a minute. I'll go to that picture.
Yeah.
Here? Is that what she's referring to?
Still not visible. Maybe that. But yeah, this one.
Remember, none of these all these photographs are not from Berenike. I've got these off the internet. They represent the finds that we had from Berenike. Cheers and mung beans. But these photographs were better illustrations of those botanical finds. So what was her question?
She's asking whether it was traded.
Well, I mean, again, we think a lot of these things that were edible were probably, again, it's indirect evidence that there were probably Indians here. We all know that that usually people's diets are very conservative, and that means they usually, if they're going to go overseas or something, they're going to want to eat the same kind of foods that they're used to at home. And so this is another argument. It's indirect and it's not 100% proof like the Buddhists are, that Indians are bringing this material in to use either to eat or to make jewelry or so on, because Romans wouldn't have done this, Egyptians wouldn't have done this. Yes, it's good evidence that this was being brought in from the subcontinent, probably by the people who were going to be consuming it. Yeah. Now, of course, the coconut could have been used for all kinds of different purposes and didn't necessarily come from India. It could have come from anywhere in the Northwest Indian Ocean. And it wasn't just, of course, the milk they were going to drink or the coconut meat, but you could recycle the core from it, to hammer into the parts of ships and then caulk those up. So the coconuts had, of course, a wide range of uses. They weren't just for food. They could be used for ship repair purposes as well.
There is one question by Shamili. She's asking, there is any analysis of mineral composition of the metals, and they can be compared with that of the iron from southern India?
Oh, okay, yeah. I know one of the big things, and again, I didn't really touch on this. We found a very interesting small little cube of iron. Talk about it. And it's so well made. Of course, one of the things that a lot of the ancient documents in the West talk about is the superb Indian iron or steel. And what they were making in the East and in India was much better than what they could make in the West. And we found a small little cube. It was not very big, maybe like that big, if you can see my fingers, underneath the entrance to another temple at Berenike. And we did have a metal guy go over it, and he's pretty sure it's probably an example of Indian iron. But again, we can't prove that. What you have to understand is a lot of the objects, most of the objects that we find at Berenike, whether they're potsherds or seeds or animal bones, are not allowed to leave the country. So if we can't analyze them on site, they don't get analyzed. So it's unfortunate the Egyptians, it's a reaction, of course, to the colonial period when, you know, the British and the French and the others were, and the Germans were removing whole temples and things from Egypt back to Europe. And this is a reaction to that. It's a sort of an overreaction, if you will. They won't let the simplest objects go out like seeds or potsherds or animal bones to be analyzed outside the country. It's understandable why they feel this way, but of course, then this means that the analysis can't be as thorough as we would like it to be. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. There is a question by Dennis Frenes. He thanks you for the amazing presentation. He asks whether there is evidence at Berenike for the role of ports in southern Arabia, which was involved in the trade between Red Sea and the Indian subcontinent.
We have, again, this is part of, I can do a whole separate lecture on South Arabians at Berenike. Yes. We have a fair amount of South Arabian pottery. We have graffiti carved on potsherds and also dipinti painted on potsherds in Hadramati, which is one of the South Arabian languages before Islam. We have some incense burners or altars that are probably from South Arabia or from Aksum. Aksum, of course, the African kingdom of Aksum also is, extended over into Southern Arabia. We also have a bronze bull's head, probably taken from a larger image that clearly has parallels with Southern Arabia. So yeah, we have plenty of evidence of Southern Arabians, probably mainly from the kingdom of Hadramaut, which is basically the coastal area of Yemen today, at Berenike. Now, whether these same people, of course, also went to India, that we can't know. But of course, as you know from excavations at Sumharam, Horori, and Oman, and so on, there is a connection there with the subcontinent. And we know that ships occasionally between the Red Sea and in would put it in places like Kana, Aden in Yemen, Horori or Sumharam in Oman. So while we can't prove that any of the South Arabians at Berenike were in India as well, there were South Arabians that, of course, as you know, did go to India.
Thank you. There is a question by Korshinik and a related question by Manisha Singh. Is there any predominant pottery at Berenike, which is also found in India?
Mediterranean or Indian? The Indian, as you know, especially from Arekamadu and more so from Patanam, I want to identify Patanam with Muziris, of course, there's a lot, especially the amphoras. The amphoras are very nicely dated. As you know, the late Roberta Tombra was working extensively on Mediterranean amphoras in the subcontinent before she passed in 2022. And those are the best evidence. And because the amphoras can be identified closely, the Mediterranean amphoras, and of course by studying the fabrics they're made of, we can identify where they're made. So the amphoras especially are great for identifying not just trade routes but also periods that those trade routes were used. And I know that there's been a fair amount of Roman amphoras, I keep calling them Roman, Mediterranean amphoras found in the subcontinent all over the place, because I know Roberta was working on those in various places. Elephantine Island near Bombay, Mumbai, for example, but other places as well. But I think Patanam/Muziris, if you believe Patanam is Muziris, of course, has turned up the largest concentration of those amphoras. So from the Mediterranean point of view, Yes, the amphoras in India. I would say the most distinctive pottery coming from the Indian subcontinent at Berenike are, of course, the rouletted ware that I showed you pictures of, but the paddle and pressed ware we get a lot of as well. And those flying saucer shaped lamps that I can't remember what wheeler number they are, but they're round. We find those not often, but sort of a steady stream of those. So, but again, of course, the pottery itself is not necessarily an indication that where the pottery was made is the same as people from India arriving right at Berenike with the pottery. They could have come separately. That's why I stuck it in the category of, it's circumstantial evidence for the presence of Indians at Berenike, but it's not 100%. You can't, a lawyer wouldn't go to court with that. Okay. But as I said, the stone images of Buddha and the inscriptions on that's hard evidence. That's proof. And so if you can do what you want with the pottery, you can say, okay, I wrote about the pottery to India. It wasn't Indian merchants returning from the Mediterranean. You can make the same argument for the Indian material at Berenike. You could say, well, maybe Indians brought it, but why couldn't a Roman merchant who and you have brought pottery in the category of possible rather than certain.
The next question is by Shikha. She's asking, what is your opinion on a Kushan gold coin hoard found from an African monastery?
I don't know about that. That's news to me. Okay. So no, I don't know about that. I know that Aksumite coins, because we have some, I didn't mention it because again, we're talking about Aksum. We have Aksumite pottery at our site from different periods. It's definitely Aksumite, there's no doubt about it. We have one Aksumite coin, interestingly, also from the church, found the same year we found the Rudrasena III coin in the church. I think it was like 2001, 1999, somewhere around there. But I didn't know about this gold coin hoard. I would like to know more about that. This gold coin hoard of Kanishka coins in Aksum. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, I'll request.
I would love to. If whoever's asking that question, if you could please pass along to me, you've got my email address, right? If you could pass along to me the citation for that, I'd love to see it. That would be very nice.
Sure, I'll request her. There is one more question related to the spices. Apart from pepper, what other spices were traded?
Well, we've got, I'll tell you, there's a lot of stuff that we have that comes from India or we think comes from India. And there's a very good book about this published back in 2006 about the botanical finds that we had from Berenike up to that point. And I can provide that citation to you. I'm not sure how easy it is to get this book in India. It's published in the US, but I'll give you that citation, and that's the best source to look at. Yes, we've done these interim reports that have a little botanical remains over the years, but that's to go to look at the botanical remains for the excavations up through the early 2000s. So I can send that, just send me an email, remind me, and I can send you that information, sure, within 5 minutes after we get off the internet, get off the Zoom meeting here.
Sure. There is a question by Priya Darshini. She's asking, is there any evidence for ivory trade between India and Berenike?
We've got ivory at the site. And of course, as you know, ivory is mentioned in the Periplus, and there's a very famous Muziris papyrus that I think you're all familiar with, dating to about 150 AD, that mentions a cargo load of ivory coming from India. But of course, once it arrives on the site, there's no way to tell if this ivory is from Africa, could be African elephants, could be hippopotamus ivory, or from India. There's no way to tell, as far as I know, the difference between those. So while we do have ivory at the site, we can't be certain it's from India, not from somewhere in Africa.
There is a question from Belina. She's asking, have you come across semi-precious stone and glass ornament workshops in Berenike?
Workshops, no. We've come across a lot of glass. In fact, high quality glass. That clearly indicates there was and we know this from the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that there was a glass trade going out from the Roman world to southern Arabia and to India. And a lot of the shapes and types of glass that we get at Berenike have very close parallels in India, especially those glass pillar bowls, they're called. Those you find those all over the place from the late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD. They're found in huge numbers at Berenike. They're found in southern Arabia. They're found in India. I know we found them at Arikamidu. We found them at Ptolemaic, and they're found throughout Central Asia as well. So the glass trade, yeah, we have not just that talks about that, but we have a lot of evidence from Berenike. Now, the problem is the glass at Berenike is at Berenike. So was it intended to be exported and somehow on its journey to Berenike from somewhere else in the Mediterranean became broken and therefore was discarded at Berenike? Was it used by people living at Berenike itself? So both those are both possibilities. Items destined for export that broke before they could go on the ships and they just threw it away. So, again, was that stuff destined for an Indian customer? Possibly, but we can't prove that 100%.
There is a question from Jasira. She's asking more information about the street with shops. Any structural features related to it?
Yeah, we have a couple of streets. Let me go back. If you want me to go, let me go back to the to this. Okay. So you see, this is that geomagnetic planet. This temple here. This is an older image. And then there's a street that goes, you see it right here? It heads east-west down to the sea. This is, in fact, the church. Someone was referencing it. So that's an east-west street. And then here's a north-south street. Okay. And along both of these streets here, we have a whole series of shops. And what's so interesting is that the shops themselves, and they were selling all kinds of things, would be on the ground floor. And these buildings were multiple story, at least 2 stories, maybe 3. And we know in the upper stories, by the way the everything fell and the way we excavated, we know in the upper stories above the shops were living quarters. So people were living upstairs and they had their business downstairs. And that's, of course, extremely typical of the Mediterranean in antiquity and today. I think it's in India. So these interesting shops along here and here, that's what she's referring to. All of these date to the 4th and 5th centuries AD. And you keep saying, well, I keep referring to all this late material. You have to understand all the earlier material, of course, is going to be way below the later material. And we haven't excavated that. And the few places where we've tried to excavate down into deeper layers, it's a real problem because, of course, this is all sand. It's not like some of the sites in India, which are clay, and you can cut these huge, deep trenches without any worries of those trenches collapsing. But in the sand, of course, you can only dig so deep before the sand walls of the trenches start to collapse. So when you get below about 2 meters, unless it's a huge trench, it becomes very dangerous to work there. So that's one of the reasons that we haven't gotten down into early layers here. Now, over in this part of the site, there's very little later material. It's all early. Here is 3rd, 2nd century BC. And you don't have to dig centimeters to hit the 3rd, 2nd century BC. But over here, it's a much bigger buildup. And those are our problems. So they're technical problems, and we don't know how to solve them to be able to dig deeper than about 2 meters in this part of the site. It's just too dangerous. And even if you could solve the problem, how do you prevent the bulks, the edges of the trenches from collapsing? You can't. We tried everything. There's nothing you can do. The wind and the rain and so on. Yes, there's a lot of rain here in the winter, believe it or not. Will destroy these. And you can put sandbags up. We've tried all kinds of tricks. None of it works. So that's the reason we haven't gotten down to deeper layers here than we have. The Isis temple is nice because it's right there. We know it was built in the 1st century AD, sometime in the 30s, probably AD, and it continued to be used as a religious shrine into the 4th century AD. It continued to be used after that into the 5th and maybe even the 6th. At that point, we have no evidence it continued to be used as a temple. It was probably more used as a place where squatters would go and live, making use of the stones around, or people were robbing the stones out of here to take them and build something somewhere else.
Oh, we have a lot of questions, I think, but we can take one or two.
Okay.
One question is about the cooking vessels from Indian cooking vessels found at Berenike. Any
Go back.
information?
Yeah, let me go get to those. Okay. So this is the coarse cooking ware stuff. This is not relevant. I mean, here you can see a piece of related ware here, and that's not what they're talking about. This would have been like dinnerware. This is what you would have put the food on to eat at dinner or lunch or whatever. So you're talking about this material here, for example, right? So what was the question again?
More information on the Indian cooking vessels. I mean, it's not
okay. Well, there's been a couple of chapters. There's been a couple of chapters that have been written by Roberta Tomber and Vimla Begley in some of our Berenike volumes about the Indian pottery from Berenike. But of course, those, as you know, Vimla died in, I think, 2000. Roberta died in 2022. So we haven't really had much. We have pottery specialists on site. They, of course, can identify this material. But the last two things the last 2 or 3 things that have been written by Roberta and or Vimla, again, those are chapters in some of our volumes published in the 90s and in the 2000s. And again, if someone sends me an email, I can provide the exact citations for those chapters.
Sure. I mean, I will also request the participants, if anyone wants more information, they can write to me, and so that I can request Professor Stephen. We can take one last question if Dr. Sila Tripathi is there. Dr. Sila, are you there?
Okay.
Yes.
Sila,
Yeah, I'm there. Hi, Steve.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Sorry, I was thinking the lecture is at 7 p.m., but I came to know that it is 6. No problem. I could manage. The thing is, this last time you were talking about the stone anchors found in Berenike. Stone anchors.
Hang on. Do you mean, let me see, are you talking about these, the cameo blanks?
No, stone anchors.
Oh, the
anchors.
Stone anchors. Yeah. Well, we have we have iron. Those, the 2 or 3 we found, we've only found 2 or 3 metal ones, are all recycled into later walls. So the stone ones, we actually, interestingly, let me go back to this just a minute. Where is it here? Stone ones, actually, we only have 1 or 2. They come from this early period here. And one of them, and I didn't show a picture again because, we weren't talking about that, it's got a round top, and then the rest of it's sort of rectangular, and it's got a huge hole, you know what I'm talking about, right at the top. And we found it actually discarded into a well, in a cistern in a well. And we suspect, and the harbor's right down here, we suspect it came off a ship and then was reused in the well area as a counterweight to lift water out of the well from a pole. But we don't know where it was made. And it could be later. It could be Roman period that was thrown in there. We don't have a good date for it, for the anchor itself. We have an idea of when it was discarded, but not when it was made. And we don't know where it was made. So the number of anchors we have are few and far between. Off the top of my head, like I said, 2 or 3 at the most. Iron ones were recycled into these later buildings. and this stone one that I was just talking about, that we found discarded into a well over on the western part of the site. So it's a little disappointing. I know you'd expect in a harbor to find more, But my guess is a lot of those things, if they came off the ships, immediately went into being recycled somewhere. And they may turn up when we're not looking for them. You know, it is an excavation's always like that. You're not looking for it, and you're not looking for Buddhas and they come out of the ground. You're looking for anchors, and they, you know. So I suspect we'll find more of those in the future, but so far not that many.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Stephen. It's a wonderful talk. And I think it's always closer to our hearts, like so much of interaction happened between East and West, and more evidences are coming through the excavations. Thank you so much. And once again,
like I said, these citations, just my email's out there. I'm sure that you can provide it, and I'd be glad to send you that information. Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
I thank all the participants for attending this talk, wonderful talk, and I also request you all to join us in the next month also. So thank you once again. And
okay, well,
yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, really? It's a pleasure. And we close now, and we'll be in touch.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.